The crew lounge at Denver International Airport was quiet at 6:30 a.m., that peculiar stillness that existed only in those moments before dawn fully broke. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood before the mirror mounted on the beige wall, her reflection staring back at her with an expression of professional calm. She was 42 years old, though people often guessed younger, not because of her appearance, but because of the energy that seemed to radiate from her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, regulation perfect, pinned, with the kind of precision that came from decades of discipline. Her uniform hung on her frame with the sharp crispness of someone who understood that appearance mattered, that the way you carried yourself told people whether they could trust you with their lives. But it was her eyes that really told the story. They were a pale gray blue, the kind of eyes that pilots and soldiers developed after years of staring at horizons, scanning for danger, learning to see what others missed. Those eyes had watched sunsets over the Arabian Sea. They had tracked enemy aircraft through missile-filled skies. They had witnessed things that most people would never experience and never want to. Those eyes had seen her best friends die. And those eyes, now, were fixed on the small mirror as she adjusted her uniform one more time, making sure everything was perfect. Sarah's hands moved with the kind of automatic precision that came from repetition. She straightened her tie, checked that her captain's insignia was properly affixed, and reviewed her reflection the way a soldier inspects a rifle before going into battle. Everything had to be exactly right. Everything always had to be exactly right. That was the rule she had lived by for 20 years. She reached for her flight bag, a worn leather bag that had seen better days, but which she refused to replace because it had been with her through everything. She'd carried it on her first solo flight, a shaky-handed achievement at age 19. She'd carried it through flight school, through her military officer training, through 8 years of active duty as a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force. She'd carried it through 2 combat deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. Now she carried it on civilian flights, 3 times a week, on the Denver to Washington route, as if her entire life hadn't been fundamentally transformed by the decisions she'd made along the way. None of her colleagues knew. That was the remarkable thing, really. None of the flight attendants who worked with her regularly, none of the co-pilots who trusted her with their safety, none of the passengers who boarded her aircraft with the kind of casual confidence that came from assuming their pilot knew what she was doing. None of them had any real idea who Sarah Mitchell actually was. They knew she was professional. They knew she was competent. They knew that she had logged over 12,000 flight hours, which put her in the top 1% of commercial pilots. They knew her safety record was flawless. They knew that other pilots spoke about her with a kind of respectful admiration, the way you might speak about someone who had proven themselves under pressure. But they didn't know about the 8 years she'd spent flying F-16 Fighting Falcons at speeds that pushed toward Mach 2. They didn't know about the time she'd lost her wingman over Kandahar and had to bring a damaged aircraft back with one engine failing. They didn't know about the medals that sat in a box in her apartment, gathering dust, because she couldn't quite bring herself to display them. That life, that identity, belonged to someone else now. Or at least, that's what Sarah had been telling herself for the past 4 years, since she'd made the decision to leave the military and seek something more grounded, more stable, more normal. She had wanted a life where she could sleep at night without nightmares. She had wanted a job where the stakes were about passenger comfort and on-time arrivals rather than geopolitical strategy and tactical objectives. She had wanted to disappear into the ordinary, into the machine of modern aviation where pilots were professionals, technically excellent, emotionally distant, and crucially, anonymous. The irony, of course, was that she had never truly disappeared at all. Every decision she made, every choice she executed in the cockpit, every moment of crisis management and emergency procedure, it all bore the fingerprints of her military training. She couldn't turn it off. She didn't know how to turn it off. The warrior she had been was still there, still awake, still scanning for threats that civilian aviation simply didn't present. She was like a fighter plane that had been retrofitted as a cargo hauler, still capable of its original purpose, but pretending otherwise. That Tuesday morning in June, Sarah had no idea that her compartmentalization was about to be shattered. She had no idea that by the end of the day, the life she had carefully constructed, the one where Captain Sarah Mitchell existed as a separate entity from the warrior she had been, would be exposed, revealed, and transformed in ways she couldn't have imagined. She grabbed her flight bag and headed toward the crew door, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The sun was just starting to break through the windows at the far end of the terminal, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Other crew members were arriving for their flights, flight attendants in their Navy uniforms, other pilots checking in at the operations desk, ground crew beginning the day's work. Everyone moving with purpose, everyone locked into their roles. Sarah reached Gate 7 and checked in with the gate agent, a woman named Patricia who had been working this terminal for 7 years and who smiled at her the way people smiled at reliable, familiar things. "Good morning, Captain. Beautiful day for flying," Patricia said, and Sarah nodded, because that was what you did. You made small talk. You maintained the persona of Captain Sarah Mitchell, professional commercial airline pilot. What neither of them knew, what nobody knew, was that Flight 447 would become the most important flight of her life. And by the time it was over, the world would know exactly who she really was. The aircraft was already being prepared for boarding. 180 passengers were about to entrust their lives to her. They had no idea that their pilot had spent 8 years making the kinds of decisions that determined whether people lived or died. They had no idea that the woman in the uniform had been trained by the most advanced military organization in the world for situations of crisis and extreme pressure. Sarah walked across the tarmac toward the aircraft, the Boeing 737 glinting in the early morning sun, and she felt something stir inside her, something that had been dormant for 4 years. Something that recognized with absolute certainty that her routine was about to be broken, and that before the day was over, she would need to be exactly who she had always been. The crew briefing room at Denver International Airport was functional but forgettable: beige walls, a long table scattered with coffee cups and weather printouts, and a wall-mounted television displaying radar maps and flight information. Sarah sat across from her co-pilot, David Chen, reviewing the morning's flight details with the meticulous attention that had become her trademark. David was 34, sharp as a razor, with the kind of steady competence that made Sarah instantly comfortable. They had flown together at least 30 times, and in that time, she had learned that he was reliable, professional, and most importantly, someone who didn't ask unnecessary questions. "Flight 447, Denver to Washington Dulles," Sarah said, running her finger down the flight plan. 187 souls on board, that's including crew. Weather looks clean across the entire route. Slight upper-level winds, but nothing concerning. Departure weather is VFR, and the forecast for Dulles is clear all day. David nodded, making notes on his own copy of the briefing. "Looks nominal," he said. "Aircraft maintenance log shows everything green. No outstanding issues from the previous rotation." Sarah pulled up the weight and balance sheet on the computer terminal. The numbers were exactly where they should be. The aircraft was properly loaded. Fuel was optimal for the 6.5-hour flight with adequate reserves. She calculated the takeoff performance numbers automatically, the way someone might calculate the tip at a restaurant. Muscle memory combined with disciplined precision. Crosswind component, 7 knots, well within limits. Runway distance required, well under the available runway. Everything, absolutely everything, was nominal. "We're good to go," Sarah said, signing the flight release. "Let's brief the crew." The flight attendants, 3 of them on this particular flight, gathered in the galley area just before boarding. Sarah went through the safety briefing with practiced efficiency. There was Carol, a woman in her 50s with the kind of grace that came from 25 years of serving passengers. There was Marcus, a newer flight attendant in his 20s, eager and attentive. And there was Jen, a mother of two who always seemed amused by the standard briefing, as if she'd heard it so many times that it had become almost comical. "Any maintenance concerns?" Sarah asked. "Everything looks good to me, Captain," Carol said. "Aircraft is clean, galley is stocked, all doors are functioning properly." "Good," Sarah said. "We've got perfect weather all the way to Washington, so it should be a smooth flight. Let's make sure everyone gets to their destination safely and on time." It was the same briefing she'd given 1,000 times before. The same words, the same objectives, the same promise that she would take care of them in the sky above, that she understood the responsibility of commanding an aircraft full of human beings, each one a person with a story, with people waiting for them, with futures that depended on her skill and judgment. The boarding process began at 7:15 a.m. Sarah stood near the forward galley, greeting passengers as they came aboard, doing what captains did, being visible, being present, being the symbol of authority and competence that made people feel safe. They came in waves. Business travelers in suits checking their watches, families with young children, elderly couples walking slowly down the aisle holding hands, teenagers in sports uniforms, a couple who appeared to be honeymooners based on the nervous, giddy energy between them. 187 people, 187 stories, 187 versions of hope for safe passage through the sky. Sarah made mental calculations as she watched them board. She could already sense the balance of the aircraft, the distribution of weight, the way the fuselage would sit on the runway. She could visualize the takeoff, the rotation, the climb. She could imagine every moment of the flight as if she had already lived it. Smooth air, perfect conditions, arrival at Dulles at precisely 2:17 p.m. Eastern Time. By 7:40 a.m. everyone was seated. The cabin doors were closed. David was in the cockpit running the pre-takeoff checklist, his voice steady over the intercom. Sarah reviewed everything one more time. Fuel valves, electrical systems, hydraulics, flight controls, engine instruments. Each switch, each light, each indicator telling her that the aircraft was ready to fly. At 7:43 a.m., she requested pushback from Denver Ground Control. The tug connected, and Sarah felt the familiar sensation of backward motion as the aircraft was towed away from the gate. In the cockpit, the feeling was precise, purposeful. A machine designed by thousands of engineers, built by thousands of workers, now responding to her commands. Flight 447, Denver Ground. "You are cleared to taxi to runway 35 left," the controller said. Sarah repeated the clearance back. "Roger, Denver Ground. Flight 447 is cleared to runway 35 left." She advanced the throttles slightly, feeling the aircraft respond with perfect precision. The engines hummed with a sound that was almost musical if you listened long enough, a sound that Sarah had grown to love over her years as a pilot. It was the sound of power controlled, of potential energy ready to be released. It was the sound of flight. The taxi was routine. They passed other aircraft, saw ground vehicles moving purposefully across the tarmac, felt the slight bumps of the taxiway passing beneath the landing gear. Sarah completed the before takeoff checklist with David, each item acknowledged, each response correct. The aircraft was responding perfectly. Everything was aligned. Everything was ready. As they approached the runway, Sarah saw the white stripe stretching out before them, long and straight, disappearing into the distance. Runway 35 left, nearly 12,000 feet of asphalt designed specifically for the takeoff of heavy aircraft like theirs. She had used this runway countless times. This time would be no different. At 7:47 a.m., Sarah received her final clearance. "Flight 447, you are cleared for takeoff. Runway 35 left. Wind is 320 at 8 knots. "Cleared for takeoff, runway 35 left," Sarah repeated. "Flight 447. She positioned the aircraft on the runway, centering it with the same precision she had learned in military training, never off to the sides, always centered, always aligned perfectly with the heading. In the cabin, passengers were settling in, some looking out windows, some already closing their eyes for sleep, some working on laptops. Sarah gripped the control yoke, felt the aircraft respond to the slightest pressure from her hands. She took a breath, a deep breath that seemed to fill the entire cockpit with purpose and intention. "Okay, David," she said quietly, "let's go to work." She advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling the engines respond with increasing power. The aircraft began to move, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. 40 knots, 60 knots, 80 knots. The runway scrolled beneath them. The nose was high. The rotation speed approached. At exactly 175 knots, Sarah pulled back on the yoke, and the aircraft lifted gracefully from the runway. The wheels left the pavement. The aircraft became what it was designed to be, a flying machine, elegant and powerful, rising into the clear Denver morning sky. "Positive rate," David announced. "Gear up." Sarah raised the landing gear handle, and she felt the subtle shift in the aircraft's motion as the wheels retracted into the fuselage. They climbed through 1,000 feet, then 2,000, then 3,000, leaving Denver behind, heading east toward Washington, toward the routine that seemed like it would never change. What neither of them knew was that at 37,000 feet, over the mountains of West Virginia, everything would transform in a single moment. The routine would shatter. The normal would become extraordinary, and Captain Sarah Mitchell would have to become exactly who she had been trained to be. But for now, there was only the climb, the slow accumulation of altitude, the perfect progression of a flight unfolding exactly as planned. At 9:47 a.m., at an altitude of 37,000 feet, somewhere above the Green Mountains of West Virginia, Sarah was thinking about lunch. She had been flying for 2 hours, and the flight was progressing with the kind of perfect, almost boring routine that characterized good flying. The autopilot was engaged. The engines were running smoothly. The air was smooth. The sky was clear. In the cabin behind her, 180 passengers were sleeping, reading, working, eating the mediocre chicken sandwich that had been served 30 minutes earlier. David was reviewing weather reports for their destination, occasionally glancing at the instrument panel, doing what co-pilots did on smooth flights, remaining alert, staying engaged but not particularly tense. Sarah sipped her coffee. It was hot and terrible, the kind of coffee that every airline served, the kind that tasted exactly the same at 37,000 feet as it did on the ground. She was thinking about whether she had time to review reports before descent when she heard it. It wasn't a sound exactly. It was more than that. It was a feeling, a vibration that started in the instruments and traveled through the entire cockpit, through the control yoke, through the seat beneath her, through her bones. It was followed, a split second later, by a sound, a deep, catastrophic bang that seemed to come from somewhere outside the aircraft, from the engines, from the physical heart of the machine itself. Sarah's coffee mug fell from her hand. The vibration became violent. The entire aircraft shook with a force that was wrong, fundamentally wrong. The control yoke quivered in her hands, and then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the vibration stopped. The engines, which had been humming that familiar musical sound for 2 hours straight, went silent. Not quiet, silent, the absence of sound so complete that it felt like the aircraft itself had died. Alarms screamed to life. Not one alarm, all of them. The master caution light flashed like a strobe. Engine 1 failure warning. Engine 2 failure warning. Both hydraulic system alerts. Loss of thrust indications on both engines. The instrument panel lit up with red and amber warnings, each one representing a catastrophic system malfunction. "What?" David started to say, but Sarah was already moving. Muscle memory and 8 years of military training overriding shock and fear. "Engine fire checklist," she said. her voice steady despite the fact that her heart was suddenly hammering against her ribs. She had trained for this. Not this exactly. Simultaneous twin-engine failure was so rare that it was considered almost impossible. But she had trained for crisis, for remaining calm when the world was falling apart around her. Her eyes moved across the instrument panel with practiced precision. Engine 1 temperature, rising. Fuel flow to Engine 1, 0. Engine 1 pressure dropping rapidly. Engine 2, identical readings. Not a fire then, not an engine fire, something else, something catastrophic. Both engines offline simultaneously. Engine 1 is dead, David confirmed, his voice tight. Engine 2 is Jesus. Engine 2 is also gone. Sarah's hands moved through the motions of the checklist, even as her brain was performing a different kind of calculation entirely. The aircraft was at 37,000 feet. The engines that had been driving them eastward were no longer functioning, which meant that this aircraft was now a glider, a 175,000-pound glider with 187 souls on board, and gravity was pulling them downward with increasing velocity. The nose was starting to drop slightly as the weight of the aircraft reasserted itself against the lift of the wings. Sarah countered the descent with back pressure on the control yoke, trying to maintain altitude, buying time. "David, get me the glide ratio," she said. "Calculate how far we can go with our current altitude and weight." David was pale. She could see his hands shaking slightly as he worked through the calculation, reaching for the backup manual performance data because the computer systems weren't responding correctly. "With current weight and altitude, we can glide roughly." He paused, working through numbers that his mind was having difficulty accepting. "Roughly 48 miles. Maybe a little more if we're extremely efficient with drag management." 48 miles. Sarah's mind was already mapping the geography below them. They had been flying over the Appalachian Mountains when the engines failed. Below them was forest, hills, small towns. No major airports within gliding distance. Except. "Get me a map," Sarah said. She was already adjusting the heading, turning the aircraft slightly, descending as gradually as possible to maintain as much altitude as they could. The cabin would be panicking. The passengers would be wondering what was happening, but she couldn't think about that right now. She couldn't think about anything except the mathematics of physics and survival. David pulled up a map on the navigation display. Sarah's eyes scanned the green landscape below, looking for anything that resembled a suitable landing surface. The problem was immediately apparent. This was mountainous terrain. There were no runways. There were no suitable fields. There was nothing that a 737 could land on except Interstate 81, a straight, relatively level highway cutting through the mountains like a ribbon drawn across the landscape. It was insane. It was impossible. It was also their only chance. "David, get on the radio," Sarah said. "Declare an emergency. Tell them we've lost both engines and we're going to attempt a landing on Interstate 81 in Virginia. Give them our position and vector them in." "Both engines." David looked at her like she had said something in a foreign language. "Sarah, did you say both?" "Both engines are offline," she confirmed, her voice absolute calm, the kind of calm that came from understanding that panic served no purpose. "Now get on the radio." David's hands moved to the radio with the kind of mechanical precision that came from training taking over from shock. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he transmitted. "Flight 447, we have experienced dual engine failure at flight level 370. We are declaring an emergency. We will be attempting an emergency landing on Interstate 81 north of Wytheville, Virginia." The response from air traffic control was immediate, shocked, disbelieving. Controllers had never heard of a 737 landing on a highway, but they didn't waste time on disbelief. Within moments, they were coordinating with the Virginia State Police, clearing the interstate, trying to make what should have been impossible even slightly possible. Sarah was now in full descent, managing the aircraft's energy with the precision of a surgeon. She couldn't dive too steeply, too much speed would shred the airframe. She couldn't descend too gradually, gravity would pull them down before they reached the highway. It was a balance, a calculation, a dance between physics and willpower. The altitude was dropping, 35,000 feet, 30,000 feet, 25,000 feet. The landscape was becoming clearer, more defined. She could see towns, forests, roads, and there, stretching out like salvation itself, was the highway. In the cabin, passengers had become aware that something was terribly wrong. The announcement had to be made. Sarah reached for the intercom, and even as the aircraft descended, even as alarms continued to scream, even as David was managing emergency procedures, she made her voice steady and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We are experiencing some technical difficulties. We will be landing shortly. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing." Those words, that was all she had time for, because now it was real. The highway was real. The landing was real. And Sarah Mitchell, commercial airline pilot, was about to become something else entirely. A warrior, a fighter pilot trained in impossible scenarios, about to do the only thing that could save 187 lives. She gripped the control yoke, felt the weight of the aircraft in her hands, and prepared for the most important moment of her entire life. The descent had become a controlled fall, and Sarah was acutely aware of every second slipping away, every 1,000 feet of altitude disappearing beneath them. The altimeter spun downward like the hand of a clock counting down to something, and Sarah knew exactly what it was counting down to: impact. "Altitude 24,000 feet, David announced, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "Time to nearest major airport is..." "We don't have time. We can't reach any major airport." Sarah was already aware of this. The mathematics of gliding were brutal and unforgiving. With both engines dead, they had essentially become a very heavy, very aerodynamically efficient boulder. Every second, gravity was pulling them down, and every decision she made had to account for this brutal reality. Her mind was working on multiple levels simultaneously. Part of her was monitoring the aircraft's performance, managing the descent angle, calculating fuel transfer to balance the weight. Another part was pulling up every memory of impossible situations she had faced before. Another part was thinking about the 187 people behind her, people she couldn't see, people she couldn't help directly, people whose lives now hung entirely on her ability to make the right call in the next few minutes. "We can't make it to an airport," Sarah said, stating the obvious with absolute certainty. "David, look at the map. Show me what we have." David's hands moved across the navigation display, fingers trembling slightly as he manipulated the controls. The map showed their position. Over the mountains of West Virginia, still 2 hours of flying time away from the nearest major airport, but only minutes away from impact at their current descent rate. "There's I-81, David said, his voice hollow. "There's Route 460. There's a state highway here, but Sarah, those are..." "I-81 is 4 lanes. It's straight for at least 20 miles through this section," Sarah interrupted. She wasn't arguing. She was thinking out loud, working through the variables. "Route 460 curves too much. The state highway is too narrow." What she was saying, without saying it directly, was, "Interstate 81 is the only place we might survive this." It was insane. Sarah knew this. In all her years as a pilot, military and civilian, she had never heard of a 737 landing successfully on a highway. It violated every principle of aviation safety. It was something that belonged in disaster movies, not in real life. But she was also acutely aware that real life had already violated every principle of aviation safety by giving them 2 engine failures simultaneously at altitude. Her military training had always taught her a fundamental principle: When your options are between certain death and unlikely survival, you choose unlikely survival every time. You don't accept the inevitable. You fight. You adapt. You do whatever it takes. In her mind, she could see her F-16 descending toward a desert airfield in Afghanistan, instruments partially damaged, with enemy fire coming from the ground. She had landed that aircraft on a runway that was barely operational, in conditions that had no business being survivable. She had chosen to fight rather than eject. She had chosen to bring her aircraft and herself home. This was different but the same. The physics were different but the principle was identical: find a way to survive. "Get me the dimensions of Interstate 81, Sarah said. Her voice had changed now. It was no longer the voice of a commercial airline captain. It was the voice of someone who had made a decision, and all of her training and all of her skills were now aligned toward executing that decision. David pulled up the specifications. 4 lanes, 12 feet per lane, so roughly 48 feet wide, stretches straight for approximately 22 miles through this section. Elevation varies from 2,100 to 2,400 feet. Sarah was already performing the calculations. The 737 had a wingspan of 117 feet. 48 feet wide would be too narrow for the wingspan alone. But wait, the lanes extended in both directions. If she could land in the opposing lanes, keeping the wings between the lanes, using the full width of the entire highway. "Call air traffic control," Sarah said. "Tell them we're going to attempt a landing on Interstate 81. Tell them we need them to clear all traffic immediately. Tell them everything." David's face was white, but he reached for the radio with a kind of automatism that came from training. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 447. We are descending to attempt emergency landing on Interstate 81 northbound, approximately 40 miles south of Wytheville, Virginia. We have dual engine failure. I repeat, dual engine failure. We need immediate traffic clearance on that section of highway." The response from air traffic control was immediate, professional, and tinged with disbelief. "Flight 447, confirm you are attempting landing on Interstate 81. "Confirmed," David replied. "Dual engine failure. No other options. Current altitude 18,000 feet. Descent rate approximately 1,500 feet per minute." Even as David was communicating with ATC, Sarah was adjusting the aircraft's descent. She couldn't descend too steeply. Speed would become a critical factor, and coming in too fast would mean losing what little control she might have. But she also couldn't descend too gradually. They simply didn't have the altitude to waste. It was a knife's edge, and she was balancing on it with nothing but mathematics and instinct. "What about traffic?" Sarah asked. "Are there cars on that section?" David was listening to the radio. "Virginia State Police are being dispatched. They're going to try to clear the highway, but Captain, it's mid-morning on a Tuesday. There are going to be people down there." Sarah nodded slowly. Of course there were. This was a major interstate highway, and somewhere below them, drivers were heading wherever drivers went to work, to appointments, to family visits. They had no idea that an airplane was about to drop out of the sky. "Tell them to clear everything they can," Sarah said. "Everyone. We're going to need every foot of that highway." She glanced at David, and something passed between them in that moment. An acknowledgement of the impossibility of what they were attempting, combined with an absolute commitment to attempting it anyway. This was the moment where theory became reality, where training met consequence. Sarah pulled up the performance data one more time. She ran through the numbers. Landing distance required for a 737 at this weight, at this speed, on an asphalt surface. The numbers were staggering. She would need nearly 6,000 feet to come to a complete stop if everything went perfectly. Interstate 81 gave her 22 miles, over 116,000 feet of highway. It was enough. It had to be enough. "Altitude 12,000 feet, David announced. "Captain, we're below 10 minutes to contact." Sarah's hands were steady on the control yoke. Her mind was absolutely clear. All the fear, all the uncertainty, all the weight of what she was about to attempt, she compartmentalized it. This was what warriors did. This was what she had been trained to do. "I'm going to need you to manage the communications with ATC and keep me updated on our descent rate and distance to the highway," Sarah said. "I'm going to manage the aircraft. We're going to put this aircraft down on that highway, and we're going to walk away from it." She said it with absolute certainty, as if declaring it could make it true. David nodded. There was nothing else to do but try. Sarah adjusted the descent angle slightly, managing the trade-off between altitude loss and distance coverage. The landscape below was becoming clearer, more defined. She could see individual trees now. She could see the ribbon of highway in the distance, and she could already visualize the moment when the aircraft would touch down on asphalt rather than crash into earth. 10,000 feet, David said. 9 minutes to contact." Sarah took a breath, the kind of breath a warrior takes before stepping into battle. Every skill she had ever learned, every crisis she had ever survived, every moment of training had led to this instant. "Let's go to work," she whispered. The world had narrowed to a single focus, the strip of asphalt appearing below them, growing larger with each passing second. Sarah's eyes were locked on Interstate 81, and her hands were steady on the control yoke despite the fact that her body was operating at a level of adrenaline that should have made steady hands impossible. "Altitude 8,000 feet, David's voice came through the intercom, clipped and professional. "Descent rate 1,200 feet per minute. Distance to highway, approximately 12 miles. Sarah was adjusting the descent angle constantly, making micro-corrections that required the kind of precision flying that existed at the absolute edge of human capability. Too steep, and they would build up too much speed. Too shallow, and gravity would pull them down before they reached the runway. It was a balance between physics and willpower, and she was balancing it with nothing but instinct and mathematics. She could see cars below them now, scattered across the highway. Even from this altitude, she could see them slowing, pulling to the sides, drivers looking up in confusion or terror as a massive aircraft descended toward them. The Virginia State Police had done their job. Much of the highway appeared to be clearing, but there was still movement down there, still potential obstacles. "Tell them to get everyone off the highway," Sarah said. "All traffic, get them away from this section." David was relaying the message to air traffic control, who was in turn coordinating with the state police. Sarah heard fragments of the conversation. "Aircraft descending, expecting impact in approximately 4 minutes. Clear all traffic immediately." 4 minutes. She had 4 minutes to transform an impossible situation into something survivable. The altitude was dropping rapidly now, 6,000 feet, 5,500 feet, 5,000 feet. Sarah could see individual details on the highway now, lane markings, guardrails, the texture of the asphalt. She could see trees flanking both sides of the highway, see the hills rising beyond. "Altitude 5,000 feet, David announced. "Speed approximately 220 knots, distance to highway 7 miles. Sarah was managing the aircraft's energy with surgical precision. At this speed, in a normal landing, they would be on approach, lining up with a runway, getting ready to begin the landing sequence. But this wasn't normal. This was something that existed beyond normal. She adjusted the descent angle again, trying to position the aircraft so that she would cross the beginning of the clear highway section at approximately 500 feet altitude. From there, she could begin the final approach. From there, she could assess the landing surface, evaluate any obstacles, and make the final commitment to touchdown. "Altitude 4,000 feet, David said. 4 minutes to contact." Sarah could feel the aircraft's weight now, could feel gravity asserting itself with increasing force. The wings were still generating lift, still holding the aircraft up, but it was a temporary reprieve. Without engine power, without the thrust that had been driving them forward, they were ultimately subject to the laws of physics. And physics was patient. Physics always won eventually. "Begin emergency descent procedures," Sarah commanded. "Deploy speed brakes, gear down." David moved through the checklist with practiced efficiency. The speed brakes, small panels on the wings that created additional drag, deployed with a subtle shift in the aircraft's motion. Sarah felt the change immediately. The descent rate increased slightly, which was exactly what they wanted. They were bleeding off altitude now, trading height for positioning. The landing gear lowered next. Sarah heard the mechanical sound of hydraulics engaging, felt the subtle shift as the wheels dropped into the airstream. The drag increased further. Speed began to decrease. 210 knots, 200 knots, 190 knots. Perfect. Landing speed for a 737 was approximately 160 knots. She needed to bleed off another 30 knots before touchdown. "Altitude 3,000 feet, David said. 2 miles to highway." The landscape was becoming terrifyingly clear now. Sarah could see individual vehicles on the sides of the highway, could see people, actual human beings, standing beside their cars, looking up at the descending aircraft. She could see the detail in the trees, the shadows cast by the hills. This was real. This was actually happening. "Altitude 2,000 feet, David called out. 1.5 miles. Sarah made a minute adjustment to the heading, lining the aircraft up with the highway. From this altitude, she could see what appeared to be a relatively clear section stretching out before them. 2 miles of asphalt, maybe more. It was enough. It had to be enough. The aircraft crossed the first of the hillsides, marking the approach to the highway. Sarah could see the pavement clearly now, see the individual lane markings. She could see a few vehicles still on the shoulder, moving away. The state police had done their job. The highway was clearing. "Altitude 1,000 feet, David announced. 1/2 mile to touchdown, speed 180 knots. Sarah was now in the final moments before the landing. The aircraft was positioned correctly, aligned with the highway, descending at the right rate. All that remained was the execution. "Flaps," she commanded. "Give me landing flaps, full extension." David deployed the flaps. The aircraft's nose rose slightly as the additional surfaces extended, increasing drag and decreasing lift. Speed bled off further. 175 knots, 170 knots, 165 knots. "Altitude 500 feet, David said, his voice rising slightly in pitch despite his attempt to remain professional. "Landing checklist complete. All systems configured for landing." Sarah could see the beginning of the clear section of highway now. She could see the asphalt stretching out before her like a runway, not quite as wide as a real runway, but close enough to try. "Altitude 300 feet, David said. 100 feet to touchdown zone." Sarah made her final adjustment to the descent rate. The aircraft was now descending at approximately 300 feet per minute, fast, but not dangerously so. The speed was good, 162 knots, just barely above stall speed. "Altitude 200 feet, David said. 50 feet to touchdown." Sarah could see everything now in perfect detail. The lane markings, the asphalt, the guardrails, a sign reading mile marker 47. She could see the point where she would touch down, could visualize the moment when the wheels would make contact with the asphalt. "Altitude 100 feet, David said. 20 feet to touchdown." Time seemed to move differently now, as if each second was stretching out, expanding to contain more information, more detail, more reality. "Altitude 75 feet, 50 feet, 40 feet. Sarah could see dust rising from the highway ahead of her. She could see individual asphalt particles. She could hear the wind rushing past the aircraft, hear the strain in the structure as gravity pulled downward against the wings. Altitude 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet. And then at 8 feet altitude, Sarah made the finest adjustment of all. She raised the nose just slightly, increasing the angle of attack, ensuring that the main landing gear would touch down before the nose. This was the moment where years of training, thousands of hours of flying, and the absolute core of her skill as a pilot converged. The aircraft descended those final feet, and Sarah felt the moment when the earth and the machine became one. The main landing gear touched down on the asphalt with a screech of rubber on pavement. The nose gear followed a second later. They were down. The aircraft was on the ground. "Touchdown," David said, his voice almost disbelieving. Sarah immediately applied full braking pressure, deploying every available brake, activating the anti-skid system, extending the speed brakes to maximum. The aircraft began to slow, the massive fuselage groaning against the forces of deceleration. 200 knots, 150 knots, 100 knots, 75 knots. The guardrails flashed past on either side of them. The asphalt continued beneath the wheels. Sarah kept the pressure on the brakes, kept the nose straight, kept the aircraft centered on the highway. 50 knots, 40 knots, 30 knots. They were slowing now, the aircraft still moving but decelerating, still traveling but no longer flying. 20 knots, 10 knots. The aircraft came to a complete stop, the fuselage settling onto the landing gear, the wheels no longer rolling. Silent, complete, absolute silence. For 3 full seconds, neither Sarah nor David moved. Neither of them breathed. The moment stretched out, suspended in time, containing within it the weight of everything they had just accomplished. Then, from the cabin behind them, came a sound that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life in the best possible way. The sound of 180 people realizing they were alive. For 3 seconds, there was nothing. Then the cabin erupted. It wasn't a scream exactly, though there was plenty of that. It was something deeper, something that came from the core of human beings who had just been given a reprieve from death. It was crying and laughing and praying and disbelief, all mixed together, in a sound that seemed to shake the fuselage as much as the engine failure had. A woman in seat 14C stood up so suddenly that she knocked the tray table in front of her aside. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her arms wrapped around herself as if she was afraid that if she let go, she would fall apart. Behind her, a teenage boy was pressed against the window, his face streaked with tears. In the back of the cabin, an elderly man was on his knees in the aisle, his hands clasped together in prayer, repeating "thank you, thank you, thank you" over and over like a mantra. The flight attendants, Carol, Marcus, and Jen, moved through the cabin with the kind of grace that came from training meeting overwhelming emotion. Carol immediately began checking on passengers, asking if anyone needed medical attention, making sure that nobody had been injured in the landing. Marcus was at the emergency exit, ready to assist with evacuation if necessary. Jen was in the forward galley, her hands shaking as she reached for the intercom to communicate with the cockpit. In the cockpit, Sarah hadn't moved. Her hands were still on the control yoke, her body locked in the position it had assumed during the landing. For a long moment, she couldn't process what had just happened. Her mind was still in descent mode, still calculating angles and rates and distances. It took several seconds for her brain to accept that the flight was over, that the aircraft was stopped, that they were alive. "Sarah," David's voice came from the right seat. It was small, almost childlike. "Sarah, we made it. We actually made it." Sarah slowly released her grip on the control yoke. Her hands dropped to her lap, and that was when the shaking started. Not fear. The fear had been compartmentalized, locked away where it couldn't interfere with the flying. This was something else. This was the release of tension so profound that her body couldn't contain it. "Get on the radio," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. "Tell them we're down. Tell them the aircraft is secure. Tell them to begin emergency response procedures." David nodded, moving through the motions with automatic precision. Virginia Emergency Services, Flight 447 has successfully made emergency landing on Interstate 81 at mile marker 47. Aircraft is on the ground. All passengers and crew are accounted for. We are preparing for evacuation. The response was immediate. Within seconds, state police began arriving on the scene. Paramedics who had been standing by started moving toward the aircraft. News helicopters could already be heard in the distance, the distinctive sound of rotors approaching from multiple directions. Sarah unbuckled her harness and stood up, her legs trembling slightly. She had to sit back down. The adrenaline crash was hitting her now, all at once, all the stress and fear and impossible pressure that she had held in check during the landing suddenly released, flooding through her system like a dam breaking. "Captain," Carol appeared in the cockpit doorway, her face streaked with tears. "Captain, are you okay?" Sarah looked at Carol and found that she couldn't speak. Instead, she simply nodded, then stood again, this time managing to stay upright. She needed to see the cabin. She needed to see the passengers. She needed to understand what she had actually accomplished. She walked through the cockpit door and emerged into the cabin, and what she saw there would stay with her for the rest of her life. The aircraft was intact. Seat backs were straight. Overhead bins were closed. It looked like a completely normal airplane that had just landed at a completely normal airport. But the people inside it were not normal. They were people who had been given their lives back. A woman stood up as Sarah appeared. She didn't say anything. She simply reached out and grabbed Sarah's hand, holding it with a grip so tight that it hurt. Tears were pouring down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for saving my daughter's life." Sarah saw the daughter then, a young woman, maybe 20, sitting in the next seat, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. "We're going to have an evacuation," Sarah said, her voice steadier now. "Everyone please follow the instructions of the flight attendants. Exit via the emergency slides. When you get outside, move away from the aircraft. First aid stations are being set up. Please help each other." She repeated the instructions as she moved through the cabin, her presence somehow grounding people, giving them permission to move, to act, to process what had happened. An elderly man reached out and squeezed her arm as she passed. "I've been flying for 50 years, he said. "I've never seen anything like what you just did. That was impossible. That was absolutely impossible, and you did it anyway." By the time Sarah reached the rear of the aircraft, the evacuation had begun. Paramedics were waiting at the bottom of the emergency slides, helping people down, checking for injuries, making sure everyone was accounted for. The statistics would later show that there was only one serious injury, a passenger who hadn't been seated during the landing, who had struck their head against an overhead bin and would require hospitalization but would ultimately recover fully. One injury among 187 people. 0 fatalities. It was statistically impossible. It violated every principle of aviation accident statistics. By all reasonable expectations, a dual-engine failure at altitude, resulting in an emergency landing on a highway, should have resulted in massive casualties. The fact that 186 of 187 people emerged completely unscathed, that the aircraft itself remained largely intact, that the landing was executed with such precision that it seemed rehearsed rather than improvised, it was a miracle. Or at least, it would be described that way in the media reports that were already being composed by journalists arriving on the scene. Sarah stood in the terminal of Interstate 81, a strange thought that the highway had become a terminal, a place of transition between death and life, and watched as her passengers emerged onto the asphalt. She watched as families embraced each other. She watched as strangers hugged like old friends. She watched as people fell to their knees and kissed the ground. News helicopters circled overhead now. Police cars lined the highway on both sides. And standing there, in her captain's uniform, Watching the chaos of rescue and gratitude and miracle unfold around her, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like a soldier again, not in the traumatic way, not in the way that was connected to loss and danger, but in the way that meant she had been tested and had endured. She had been asked to do something that seemed impossible, and she had done it. She had taken her training, her skill, her experience, and she had used it to save 186 lives. That was the mission. That had always been the mission. By evening, her name was trending on every social media platform on Earth. News anchors were breathlessly recounting the story. Aviation experts were studying the flight data, trying to understand how a 737 had landed on a highway and achieved something that no pilot had ever accomplished before. But none of them yet knew about the fighter pilot. None of them yet knew that Captain Sarah Mitchell's training for impossible situations had come from places far more intense than commercial aviation school. That revelation was still coming. The investigation began before the passengers even reached the hospital. NTSB investigators, FAA safety experts, and Boeing engineers descended on Interstate 81 like a swarm of very intelligent locusts, each one focused on understanding how a catastrophic double-engine failure had somehow resulted in the most successful emergency landing in commercial aviation history. They impounded the flight data recorder, the so-called black box, and rushed it to a laboratory where technicians carefully extracted the information, reading the aircraft's final moments with surgical precision. They reviewed the cockpit voice recorder, listening to every word spoken, every breath taken, every moment of decision-making that had led to the miraculous outcome. It was during this review, on the second day after the landing, that something remarkable surfaced in the data. The cockpit voice recordings captured every radio transmission. They captured Sarah's calm, measured responses to air traffic control. They captured David's increasingly panicked updates. They captured the moment when Sarah made the decision to attempt the highway landing. And most significantly, they captured the moment when the controller cleared her for final descent. But the words used by the controller were strange. Instead of addressing her as Flight 447, the controller had used a different designation. The exact words recorded in perfect digital clarity were, "Shadow 6, you are cleared to continue descent to 2,000 feet. Shadow 6, maintain glide ratio. Shadow 6, your approach vector is optimal." Shadow 6. That call sign meant something. It was too specific, too unusual to be a standard air traffic control designation. It was a tactical call sign, a military call sign. Someone had been monitoring Flight 447 who knew Captain Sarah Mitchell in a context that had nothing to do with commercial aviation. The investigators noticed it immediately. The FAA began asking questions. Who was the controller who had used the term Shadow 6? Why had that specific designation been employed? What was the context? The answer, when it came, sent shockwaves through the aviation industry and across the entire internet. The controller, it turned out, was a former Air Force officer. He had worked as a fighter pilot before transitioning to air traffic control, and he recognized the voice on the radio as someone he had known years ago, someone whose tactical call sign in the Air Force had been Shadow. Within hours, investigative journalists had cross-referenced public records, military databases, and commercial aviation registries. What they found was a story that seemed almost designed for headlines. Captain Sarah Mitchell had not simply been a commercial airline pilot. For 8 years, 2010 through 2018, she had been a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force. Her aircraft, the F-16 Fighting Falcon. Her rank, captain. Her service record, classified. But not completely classified. Her decorations were a matter of public record. The Bronze Star. The Air Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters. The Combat Infantryman Badge, which didn't make sense until researchers realized she must have seen ground combat or been involved in tactical operations that went beyond standard fighter pilot duties. Her deployment record was sparse, but the journalists pieced it together from Pentagon announcements and military news archives. 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq, multiple combat sorties, dates that aligned with some of the most intense military operations of the decade. By the morning of the 3rd day after the emergency landing, every news outlet in the world was running the same story. Fighter pilot turned commercial airline captain saves 180 passengers in impossible landing. The narrative was irresistible. The woman who had saved all those lives wasn't just a skilled commercial pilot. She was a warrior. She was someone who had been trained in the most intense pressure situations imaginable. She was someone who had flown combat missions. She was someone whose call sign, Shadow, suggested she had operated in classified contexts, doing things that the public might never know about. At Horizon Airlines headquarters, the public relations team was in complete chaos. Phone lines were ringing constantly. Every news station wanted an interview. Every magazine wanted a feature. 60 Minutes sent a crew. The Today Show wanted her. BBC, CNN, every international news outlet, all of them wanted access to Captain Sarah Mitchell, the fighter pilot who had become a hero. But Sarah herself was largely unavailable. She was sequestered in a hotel room near the airport, her phone turned off, her door locked, her mind trying to process the fact that her compartmentalized life had just exploded into the public consciousness. A knock came at her door at 2 p.m. on the 3rd day. When she opened it, she found her commanding officer from her fighter squadron, Colonel James Harrison, now retired, who had somehow tracked her down. He was older now, his hair completely gray, his face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from decades of responsibility. But his eyes were still sharp. He embraced her, and for a moment, Sarah felt something release inside her, the tension of trying to be 2 different people simultaneously. "You did good out there," he said simply. "Real good. The kind of flying that reminds you why we trained the way we trained." "I was just flying a plane," Sarah said, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. "No," Colonel Harrison said. "You were flying with the training of 8 years of military service. You were using decision-making skills that you learned in combat. You were making calculations that civilians never learn to make. You were being exactly what we trained you to be, a pilot who could handle impossible situations." The next morning, Sarah agreed to one interview. She chose NPR because she respected the organization's thoroughness and their commitment to accuracy. The interview was scheduled for 10 a.m. in a quiet conference room at Horizon Airlines headquarters. The reporter's name was Michelle Chen, a woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and the kind of preparation that suggested she had done her research thoroughly. She opened with the obvious question. "Captain Mitchell, the world knows now that you spent 8 years as a fighter pilot in the Air Force before becoming a commercial airline pilot. How much of what you did on Flight 447 was commercial aviation training, and how much was military training?" Sarah paused for a long moment. This was the question that would define the narrative. This was the moment where she could claim that her military past had nothing to do with the landing, that she was just a skilled professional doing her job, or she could tell the truth. "The decision to land on the highway," Sarah said slowly, "that wasn't in my commercial training. In commercial aviation, you're taught to always aim for an airport. You're taught to follow procedures. You're taught to manage risk within established parameters. But in military training, you learn something different. You learn to evaluate options that shouldn't exist, to make calculations that shouldn't work, to do things that people say are impossible because sometimes impossible is the only option available." Michelle leaned forward. "Are you saying that if you hadn't had military training, you might not have made that decision?" "I'm saying that military training teaches you a different relationship with impossible situations," Sarah said carefully. "It teaches you that sometimes the thing that seems most dangerous is actually your best chance at survival. It teaches you to trust your training even when every instinct is telling you to panic. "And did you panic?" Michelle asked. Sarah shook her head. "No, I didn't have time to panic. I had too much to do. In combat, you learn to compartmentalize fear. You learn to put it aside to focus on the mission, to execute the plan. That's what I did on Flight 447. I compartmentalized the fear and I flew the airplane." The interview would be broadcast that evening, and it would become the defining statement about who Sarah Mitchell was and how her two identities, the fighter pilot and the commercial pilot, had collided in a moment of crisis. But that evening, sitting alone in her hotel room, Sarah understood something that the public might never fully grasp. She hadn't chosen to become a hero. She had simply chosen to do what she had been trained to do. The warrior and the pilot had never been separate people. They were the same person, wearing different uniforms, serving the same mission in different ways. And now the world knew it. 3 months after the emergency landing, Sarah sat in a quiet room at Federal Aviation Administration headquarters in Washington, D.C. The room was nondescript. Beige walls, a polished mahogany table, the kind of institutional space where important decisions had been made for decades. But what was about to happen in this room would echo far beyond the walls that contained it. The FAA administrator, a woman named Patricia Williamson who had built her career on excellence and accountability, stood at the head of the table with a certificate in her hands. The certificate was ornate, official-looking, designed to commemorate something significant. Sarah had received certificates before, military decorations, commendations from her airline safety awards. But this one felt different. This one felt like something that belonged to a person who had transformed the way people thought about aviation. "Captain Mitchell," Administrator Williamson said formally, "the Federal Aviation Administration is honored to present you with the Pilot of the Year award. This recognition is given to the pilot who best demonstrates exceptional skill, judgment, and integrity in the operation of aircraft. Your landing on Interstate 81 represents the single most significant example of emergency aviation management in modern history. Your actions saved 186 lives and prevented what would have been a catastrophic loss." Sarah accepted the certificate with a kind of detached gratitude. She had become numb to accolades over the past 3 months. Every organization imaginable wanted to recognize her. The president had called her. International aviation associations had nominated her for various honors. The media had begun referring to her as the pilot who landed on a highway, as if this single act had become her entire identity. But what Sarah cared about, what truly mattered to her, was something else entirely. 3 weeks after the awards ceremony, she received a call from the United States Air Force Academy. They wanted to include footage of her landing in their pilot training curriculum. Not just acknowledge it, but make it mandatory viewing for every cadet who trained to be a fighter pilot or transport pilot. The logic was simple. They wanted cadets to understand that the impossible could be achieved through a combination of training, mental discipline, and absolute commitment to the mission. Next came the commercial aviation schools. Top Gun-level intensive programs wanted to include her emergency landing in their curriculum. Flight schools across America began teaching the Interstate 81 landing as a case study in crisis management. Aviation students analyzed her decisions frame by frame, learned about glide ratios and descent management, and the psychology of remaining calm under extreme pressure. Sarah's name became synonymous with excellence, with courage, with the idea that human skill and determination could overcome circumstances that should be unsurvivable. But the thing that truly changed her life came in an envelope that arrived at her apartment on a Friday afternoon in September. The letter was handwritten, in the careful cursive of someone who was taking time to be thoughtful about what they were communicating. The envelope was postmarked from Colorado. Sarah opened it carefully, and as she read, tears began to stream down her face. "Dear Captain Mitchell, My name is Emma Rodriguez, and I was a passenger on Flight 447. I was sitting in seat 23B, the window seat. I remember looking out at the mountains as we descended, and I thought we were going to die. I was 17 years old, and I thought I was going to die. I want to tell you something that nobody else probably knows. Before that day, I was lost. I had just been diagnosed with depression. I was struggling in school. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I was, quite honestly, in a dark place. My parents had forced me on that flight to visit my grandmother in Washington because they thought I needed to get away to clear my head. I resented being on that plane. Then you saved my life. But more than that, you showed me something that I needed to see. In those final moments before we landed, I was terrified. But I was also watching through a gap in the cockpit door, and I could see you. I could see that you were calm. I could see that you weren't panicking. I could see someone taking control of an impossible situation and refusing to accept defeat. It changed everything for me. That's why I'm writing to tell you that I've been accepted to the United States Air Force Academy. I'm going to be a fighter pilot. I'm going to be someone like you. Someone who can handle impossible situations, someone who can protect people, someone who refuses to accept that anything is beyond my capability. I don't know if you remember me. You probably don't. There were 180 other people on that plane. But I want you to know that you saved my life twice. Once when you landed the aircraft, and once when you showed me what a person is capable of achieving when they refuse to give up. Thank you for everything. Emma Rodriguez. P.S. I'm going to request the call sign Storm when I become a fighter pilot. Storm chases shadows. I thought you'd appreciate that. Sarah read the letter 3 times. Each time she wept. Emma had found meaning in the crisis. Emma had taken the moment of terror and transformed it into inspiration. Emma was going to be a fighter pilot. A new generation was rising. A new warrior was beginning her journey, inspired by a moment that had seemed like pure catastrophe at the time, but had become, in retrospect, a moment of profound meaning. That evening, Sarah sat on her apartment balcony overlooking Denver. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She thought about the 8 years she had spent flying F-16s. She thought about the missions, the danger, the weight of responsibility that came with being a soldier. She thought about why she had left the military, the desire for something more stable, something more grounded, something that didn't carry the constant shadow of loss and trauma. But sitting there, reading Emma's letter, Sarah realized something fundamental. The mission had never changed. Whether she was flying a fighter jet over hostile territory or piloting a commercial airliner over domestic airspace, she was doing the same thing. She was protecting people. She was accepting responsibility for human lives. She was choosing, again and again, to do whatever it took to bring people safely home. The uniform had changed, but the mission remained eternal. Over the following months, Sarah received hundreds of letters. Some were from passengers on Flight 447, expressing gratitude and sharing how the experience had changed their perspectives on life. Some were from aspiring pilots, telling her that her story had inspired them to pursue aviation. Some were from military personnel, telling her that her actions had reminded them why they served. But Emma's letter remained special. Emma represented something that Sarah hadn't anticipated. The possibility that her actions could ripple outward, could touch lives in ways she would never fully understand, could inspire the next generation to be better, to be braver, to be stronger. A year after the landing, Sarah returned to flying commercial routes. She was no longer a private person. Her face was known, her story was iconic. But she found that she didn't mind. Because every time she boarded an aircraft with passengers, every time she conducted a pre-flight check, every time she took off into the sky, she was reminded of what had happened on that June morning over the Appalachian Mountains. She was reminded that preparation meets opportunity in ways you can never predict. She was reminded that the warrior she had been was still present in the pilot she had become. She was reminded that sometimes the legacy you leave is not about the accolades you receive, but about the lives you touch and the dreams you inspire. And most importantly, she was reminded that the mission, protecting people, saving lives, refusing to accept the impossible, would never end. It would simply evolve, finding new forms, new expressions, new ways to manifest itself in a world that constantly needed people willing to do the impossible. Sarah Mitchell had landed an aircraft on a highway, but what she had truly accomplished was far more significant. She had shown the world what was possible when training, courage, and absolute commitment converged in a single moment of crisis. And in doing so, she had changed the trajectory of lives not yet born, dreams not yet dreamed, and futures that would extend far into a tomorrow she would never fully see. That was the real legacy.